Hello and welcome to the Medical Affairs Dialogues. Today we are exploring a very exciting and a rapidly growing sector, the medical device industry. In this episode, we want to really explore how medical affairs can really drive innovation in the medtech space, contribute to the development of cutting edge technologies, and how we can engage with stakeholders in a more meaningful manner. Our guest today is a leader in the medical device industry. He is Gregory Christopherson. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'm very sure my viewers and my audience is excited to know more about you. So I'll just elaborate a little bit of your achievements. To introduce Greg, it is really an honor because I work with him. He's my mentor, and I know him for some time. And Greg is a commercial facing bioengineer with a strong research background. Greg is dedicated to transforming scientific discoveries and cutting edge technologies into practical healthcare solutions. His expertise lies in leading cross-functional teams, skillfully bridging R&D and medical affairs to align with strategic corporate objectives. Having successfully navigated both Fortune 500 companies and startups, he drives initiatives that seamlessly integrate clinical data, marketing, and scientific education. Greg is passionate about ensuring that advancements in medical and technological fields translate into real world solutions that positively impact patients and healthcare providers. Through his executive leadership, he remains committed to advancing the frontier of healthcare innovation. Welcome to the podcast again, Greg. Our topic for today is establishing and expanding medical affairs within the medical device industry. Before we go any further, like everybody else, I'm also excited to see how your journey kind of shaped up. So my question to you is, how did you get into the medical device industry? How did you navigate through the challenges while working in this space? And how did you manage to become a leader in the same industry?
Yeah, it's a bit of a obviously wide, convoluted kind of answer, but like a lot of us in medical affairs, I think medical affairs kind of found me. And the medical device part, short and sweet, is that I grew up as an engineer, always wanted to be in engineering, and I think that kind of lends itself a little bit more directly to med tech and med device. I was born in Detroit, raised in the suburbs. I'm a Midwest guy. Went to Michigan Tech undergrad for biomedical engineering. Got my PhD in material science from Johns Hopkins out east. Just was always involved with biomaterials, stem cells, kind of how does nanotopography impact stem cell biology. And then really transitioned from being a benchtop scientist to getting really interested in translational medicine and translational kind of engineering and clinical work when I was doing my postdoc at the National Institutes of Health right outside DC, which is literally across the street from the new Walter Reed Medical Center, Military Medical Center. So working with injured soldiers coming back from Operation Enduring Freedom from Iraq and Afghanistan, and really seeing the impact that science can kind of have directly with clinics. And I just kind of thought, man, I'd really like to do that. And sometimes you just kind of continue to pull on things that challenge you and interest you. And began my industry career at LifeCell, which at the time was a late stage startup. Main kind of products were around processing of cadaver tissue and repurposing for surgical applications. I ended up doing a lot of scientific education as that for bioskills labs, cadaver labs. And when Allergan bought LifeCell, transitioned into more of obviously a big pharma kind of setting and really seeing how med device and pharma fit together. Stayed in the aesthetic space, the plastic space, became responsible really for late stage R&D or R&D of existing products. A lot of competitive testing, clinical studies for existing products, expanding claims, leading cross-functional teams. And I worked very heavily with our commercial and marketing colleagues and upstream marketing. And when Medline decided to create medical affairs and update clinical research about 6 years ago, I got headhunted from an old colleague and thought, hey, that'd be pretty neat. Startup,
Mhm.
Midwest. And that's kind of here where I am today. So I think it's just if you continue to challenge yourself and follow passion and have fun with it, I think work can still be fun. Then usually really interesting things will come your way. And I think it's pretty simple too. But the golden rule of all is just treat people how you want to be treated. I think if you're a good person to work with and your colleagues like you, then it's amazing what kind of networking will lead downstream, but what other opportunities will continue to come your way. So really simple words to live by, I think. But that's how I ended up in medical affairs. I didn't even know what it was 10 years ago, even 7 years ago. And and then I've built organizations and led teams. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I love it. I love it what you said. It's so inspiring. Your story is so inspiring. And what you said is very true. Live by simple things. Be nice to others too, as you treat others, others will treat you. And if you have fun in your work, it will become even more fun to work with colleagues that you love and like. And I think things are so simple. You are so inspiring, and your story is so inspiring. So with that, I want to move on in the discussion, and I have some questions lined up for you. My first question is, what unique challenges and opportunities does the medtech industry present for medical affairs professionals compared to the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, I I think there's two things I'd say before kind of jumping into that answer. One is that I'll probably be answering a lot of things very generally. And companies are very different in each sector. Variety is really the spice of life, particularly in med device, where you have very small to very late. But even in pharma, you have rare disease and enormous companies, right? So every setting is a
Mhm.
bit different. So I'll talk generally. And with that, I do think that everything is more alike than different. In the end, the medical affairs community is really trying to be the ones that communicate data to help patients and providers, and I think we all do that in more similar ways than we do different. Now, but to not sidestep the question, between pharma and medtech, I think the big differences are that, and I think opportunities was the word you used. You have the opportunity to usually engage much more directly with the technology, and by the technology more directly with the providers. So with physicians, with surgeons, oftentimes devices are usually kind of mechanical or diagnostic in nature, and they have the interface with them. They're also iterative. Typically, it's a huge undertaking to get a drug to market. When it gets to market, you ride the
Mhm.
patent as long as you can, and then try to eke out different ways. With device, it's constantly iterative. There's nothing preventing you from usually coming back and making tweaks to it and redesigns and going through with a less onerous regulatory pathway. So the opportunities are really to engage, I think, much more directly. You're more of a partner, like actual partner with the surgeons. You learn a lot more from how they use it, what their needs are, the unmet needs. And with that, you can really, I think, be much more active voice of coming back into your institution and using that data. So hopefully cooperating more upfront with R&D around clinical data, like new iterations of the device, your regulatory teams, like what's missing, where could you expand into different procedures. Some things are really locked in. If you're making a hip implant, probably going to only be used for a hip implant. But if you start doing something like a spinal fusion, that could be used up and down the spine. Typically, it could be used in different joint areas. And it's very important because there's on label and off label, which is another consideration. Off label use is much more of not really a gray area, but much less well defined typically, or less scrutinized maybe in device than it can be in pharma. So you typically have a little more leeway with that. And physicians find really cool ways to use products. If you start thinking of wound care, you could have very specific different indications, but the overall technology is going to be the same for wound healing, oftentimes. So I think it's learning about these new adjacencies where technology is used, bringing it back internally, and it's just in my experience been much more interactive in terms of the devices themselves. And I think that's the engineering part of me, that's the scientist part of me. Really getting to know how do these things work and how can we change them to work better. There's not quite that same flexibility oftentimes in pharma. The other big one though is usually resourcing, but I'm sure we'll probably get to kind of some other questions around that.
So I'm very intrigued to know. So, would you say that the affairs team in the medtech device space works very closely with the R&D, more closely than what we see in pharma?
It depends, like everything, but I would hopefully in a well kind of instituted medical affairs program, yes. Um, Clinical research, I think, is something where the two are pretty tight regardless. Hopefully in pharma, You have your medical affairs people. Maybe they're more downstream, but hopefully they're really involved in clinical research. That's how my team's been at Medline.
Mhm.
But for the traditional R&D, and I remember this as a scientist, as a benchtop scientist, you have all these wonderful aspirations of how a product's going to be used, and you're in the perfect environment when you do it. You have your preclinical studies, and then it meets the real world. Maybe it doesn't fall apart, but all of a sudden your expectations have to change.
Yes.
And so I think ideally you have medical affairs, and it may be under different names, different umbrellas. That's another thing too. Medical device usually oftentimes doesn't have a formalized medical affairs team. It's kind of like what I was doing before, where you were doing MSL work without knowing you were an MSL kind of thing. But hopefully, as part of that, you have a really open stream of communication between your R&D colleagues and then your product development engineers, your early scientists. It's very, very important to know what's working and what's not working. And it's very rare that engineers and scientists are clinically based usually either. Our clinical education starting out, unless you've been in there for a while, is usually pretty small. So it's that interface. It's always the interface, I feel like, where medical affairs has the most value. And one of the interfaces for devices really between the physician or the operating provider, the HCP, and the research, and that could be clinical data, but could also be just really redesigns of device in the future.
Yeah, that was very comprehensive. Thank you for clarifying all that. My next question is, how can medical affairs in MedTech drive innovation and support the development of cutting edge technologies?
Um, yeah, I think it builds on the previous question where really utilizing just the conversations and constant experience that you're having in the field to bring those, one of the buzzwords we talk about, insights. What do insights mean? They don't always have to be formal. It's great if they can be. Oftentimes, medical affairs goes to a lot of clinical conferences, medical society meetings, advisory boards. Sometimes it's just interpreting the language of the two different sides. Other times it's really listening and understanding your device or your technology very intuitively, and then seeing how it's used, and then speaking with clinicians and hearing what their honest feedback is, because they're almost always going to be very raw and honest with you. When you're going through the product development cycle, sometimes you'll have consulting surgeons, you'll have medical advisory boards. They're usually honest, but they have a relationship with you that they don't want to they know how to use it usually in development a little bit better too. Once it gets to real world application, what happens when somebody doesn't have formalized training or experience with a product that is developed? Does it stand up to the rigors? Are the results what you think they're going to be? That's where I think there's so much to add from medical affairs perspective, really bridging that gap. And also, if you're in an early environment, I think it's critical to wear so many hats. Medical affairs is, like I said, even if you're medical affairs or not, being involved in setting up any really early clinical studies is incredibly valuable. Using what knowledge you already have to kind of dictate how you think might things come from a risk perspective, from a
Mhm.
design perspective, impact perspective. It's really having that internal kind of clinical knowledge and merging the two. So I think that's the really great value between medical affairs, in my opinion. If it's a large organization, it starts to grow. Hopefully, you continue to have that sphere of influence in terms of where you should be going with new product designs or new product areas. What are therapeutic areas we could get into? So, depending on how mature you are as a company, that's where you hopefully would see an expansion of the role too, and a bigger seat at the table.
Sure, sure, makes sense. I'm very tempted to ask. You mentioned about insights. We know in the pharma world, there's so much of insights captured, and from different, like you said, conferences, congresses, MSL insights, bringing in all from all corners, insights are captured, and actually information or data is captured, and then it is translated into actionable insights, and so much data falls through the crack. What is the setting in the medtech space?
It it really depends. There's I've never had the fortune of being in a company where insights were incredibly well done. Usually, it was very personal,
Mhm.
but that's part of it too. You usually have a smaller collective web of people, and that's where it's important to be kind of still people based in a lot of what we do. Technology fills gaps, but not all of them, because insights can be complicated, it can be off cuff.
Mhm.
It could be really anything though, where it could be issues that people are having with devices. It could be competitive knowledge, particularly, right? Maybe either a new product to market, or if you're the new product to the market, how are you faring anecdotally versus other products? What are their kind of clever little designs or packaging or interfacing that, where yours either succeeds or doesn't. So you can bring that back to your marketing colleagues and say, hey, here's a differentiator that the medical community loves right now. It can be the patient advocacy side of it. I think the world's becoming more patient centric, and patient centricity is a big buzzword along with insights, and not in a bad way. Obviously, these are positive things.
No. Mhm.
But I think it medical affairs has kind of the mission statement of looking out for patients. That is part of what we do, right? We're not supposed to be sales driven and commercial driven. We
Mhm.
work very closely with those colleagues, but that's where you can bring that trust and that honest relationship to them and say, hear the voices of what we're hearing in a positive way, and also maybe in a constructive feedback. So I think there's insights can take a lot of different forms. I think it's always important to measure what your company needs to make sure that you're bringing the value back that's appropriate, because oftentimes some of the pitfalls we'll have within medical affairs, we're always a value part of the company, right? But we're not revenue generating. We're always a red mark on the ledger. So it's very important that your colleagues that have to make the decisions from a corporate governance standpoint understand what you're doing and where your value lies. And so one of the things, there's a lot of ways to do that, but it's very important within your company to understand what do they need. Because if you're bringing back insights that aren't really valuable in the way they look at it, or don't lead to product improvements or market improvements, then they're going to be less likely to listen to other insights you bring in the future. So it could be as easy as, here's what I saw from a conference, which I think impacts us. Here's new technologies that I've seen. Here's things I've actually seen when I've been out in the OR or at meetings. Here's what I've heard when I've talked with salespeople. Here's what happens when I've talked with patients and providers. And then that's where the intelligence of humankind comes in, where you have to figure out who really could use this. How do I make sure I distill this to them in a usable form? And then hopefully that becomes a self-fulfilling thing going forward, where they keep looking for more and more. And then you can begin to formalize it. What are my weekly topics, my monthly topics? What's most consumable and valuable from the other side? But I think it's also careful. You have to be very careful as a leader to not establish um, this expectation that all your people are trying to do or gather insights, right? I think they have to oftentimes be natural in some way. If you start to force them, then they also start to lose value. So it's tricky. But once again, it really comes back to what's the role within your organization, how much value you already proven in your organization, how much trust they have. The higher each of those things are, the easier and more repeatable it is to create insights going forward.
I love your answers and your responses. This is so valuable. Um, Thank you for being so elaborate and comprehensive. This will really help my viewers and my audience to actually understand what's going on in the medtech space, and in contrast to pharma, which we all know mostly. My next question is a little like switching gears from what we are talking. Um, I want to ask you, how does stakeholder engagement in the medtech space differ from that in pharmaceuticals, and what strategies have proven effective?
Yeah, I think it comes down to kind of defining stakeholder. Because in my mind, there's two types of stakeholders. There's your internal stakeholders, and then there's your external stakeholders. So your internal stakeholders being, who are you working with to align on business objectives? You're not commercial, you're not trying to make sales, but everything we do impacts the reputation of the company and the products. Uh, so it's very important to understand from an internal perspective, how are these things being talked about? How are they being positioned? What does the data really tell you and not tell you? What are the gaps? Because then I think with your internal stakeholders, you can align on, what kind of messaging do we really want to have externally? And what are you looking for me to really figure out that I can bring back that would be helpful for you as we start to do
Mhm.
future either releases or product redesigns, whatever it may be, like we talked about before. And then your external stakeholders are the ones that you've created relationships with. That could be your clinical research sites. They could be your kind of key thought leaders or opinion leaders. They could be your launch sites for new products. When I was at Lifestyle and Allergan, I developed this very great set of relationships with some of the leading plastic surgeons in the world. And a huge part of that, I considered them external stakeholders. They had expectations from me, from the company side, about the research and using what they were sharing with me, and having a confidence in things that they could tell me. It's very important when you create trust like that that there's going to be people externally and internally, and you never want to put yourself in conflict. So that's why I think it's very
Mhm.
important, if you're somebody who's particularly in the field, to understand what's your leadership expectation of you, what's your compliance standard for all these things too. Because even though we think of compliance as black and white, it's very much a risk proposition of the company. So you have to know your company, know what your risks are, know what your really like levels of desired need are. What kind of information do I want, when, where, how, but then also to make sure that you're taking care of the people that you operate with outside of your central building. Whether if there's nurses and physicians and promises that you've made and information that they're relying on, and you say you're going to
Mhm.
deliver them, you better make sure that your external stakeholders are happy with all that too. So it's important to properly promise and follow through, just like kind of anything. I think in life, once again, it's those general good principles will take you far. But just make sure that you never put yourself in conflict, because your internal stakeholders are the ones that you really have to align with upfront, and your external stakeholders are often the ones that you need to define and follow through with.
Is there any like remarkable difference in handling stakeholders in the medtech space versus pharmaceuticals?
I
Because this
think
is what you
so.
what you just said seems very much like what we do, and seems like very similar. So I want to know if there is any difference, or no, there's no differences. Handling stakeholders is the same.
There are differences. I generally, like I said earlier, generally speaking, medical affairs is typically much more established in pharma. So it means that people know who medical affairs is, they know what to go them for, they know the compliance standard they have, they know that there's rules of engagement. With the med device side, there's usually a lot more education. Med affairs teams are typically smaller. They might not have nearly the biggest, as large a sphere of influence. They may not have the bigger responsibility either, depending. You definitely probably don't have the resourcing in terms of manpower and budget as other things. So you have to be much more directive with what you're doing, and you have to showcase your value. So it's much more important, I think, within med device. It's always important to align upfront with what you need to deliver.
Mm.
But I think in med device, it's a little bit more critical, and you probably work a lot more closely with commercial colleagues within the med device space. I've typically seen much more of a firewall commercially between medical affairs and commercial in pharma. I think
Mhm.
part of that is because we always talk about how med device trails pharma by like this 10 to 15-year lag for a lot of things. So from a regulatory standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, there's always been more leeway. And I think from a data standpoint, there's way less in med device. So with that, you may be generating a lot more. You need to generate a lot more data as
Mhm.
part of your medical affairs team, which means that you're probably going to be much more in tune with your post-launch commercial and your post-launch regulatory, and like I said, your R&D side. So in my experience, it's been touching a lot more groups, but maybe having less ownership. So I think typically with med device, because of the less established pattern of medical affairs and responsibilities, I think generally you have to go to work through influence a lot more. But the general principles between the two, like I said earlier, they're much more similar than different. At the end, we're all trying to educate providers, provide data, get data, and make the medical community a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't have agreed more. Talk to me a little bit, briefly, about the data piece. Is there a lot of data available in the medtech space, or is it that there are conservative ways of processing data and there's not much? What do you see?
Yeah, there's really any. The long and short of it is that the regulatory approval process to get most medical devices onto the market is either much shorter and much faster and cheaper, or mostly shorter and cheaper and faster. You rarely ever have to get through phase 3 trials, clinical trial, these large, very comprehensive trials. Med device typically can get a lot of products to market, either iterative products or even new products, with scant or no clinical data, just through a
Oh, wow.
510(k) pathway, or PMA or BLA for other things too, via cell tissue.
Mhm.
There's all these different pathways which can be kind of convoluted, but typically don't require nearly the level of data, sometimes even any kind of clinical data, to get approval. And so the strategy is often medical device to launch your product and gather data afterwards. I'm not saying the ways that's how we should do it, but that's historically been the way. So the onus becomes a little bit more difficult for medical affairs because you can't typically go talk really significantly and strongly about here's how the device works, here's how
Hmm. I was
revenue
just thinking
shows
about
in.
that. Hmm.
The health economics piece does not exist oftentimes. So you have to create it. It's the whole build the ship as you're sailing it or build the plane as you're flying it. But it also makes it much more critical in terms of how you invest dollars and time and relationships, because it's a huge value add to be able to bring any of that data back. And that's where, like I said earlier, it's very important to align with your commercial teams and your regulatory
Hmm.
teams and say, what are the gaps? Where do we want to do? Do we have a window for reimbursement here? Reimbursement's a whole other deal too. So it's data is usually not the friend for medical device. It's a lot more wild west in that way. But you really get to see these things come in real time and change how you think about products and change how you make the next iteration too. So that's where I think that impact, like we talked about earlier, really comes to play, and it's a lot of fun. That's that's why I'm still in med device and I love med device. I think it's interactive and it's a little bit messy, but it's just really cool in engineering in a way.
Yeah, I love the fact that you said now it actually makes sense, that you said that you're building the boat or the ship as you are sailing. So there are a lot of things that you have to do together with these stakeholders, internal stakeholders, the commercial partners, the R&D partners, because you all have to come together to make this process work through, more so for medtech than pharma. And I can see that why now. So great answers. Thank you so much. My last question to you is, what key challenges do you anticipate for medical affairs in the evolving medtech space? And how can the industry proactively prepare to address them as part of future trends?
I think we're seeing a lot of it already globally. So the big changes in MDR in Europe, the regulatory functions there have an enormous onus now on data and patient privacy. So those are two huge buckets that typically medical device never had to worry about, and it completely flipped in the European sector, and it's been very disruptive, but I think with good intention. So just generally speaking, as healthcare has become so much more expensive, health economics has become a bigger part of it. Value-based healthcare. Do your products really work? A lot of times you can also see iterative improvement from using devices, and the question now becomes, is that good enough for the amount of money I pay? Reimbursement, depending on what sector you're in, is very strange, right? You could get a global payment for using just any kind of procedure, and your product gets tucked in as part of that, or you can get reimbursed specifically for your product, and you have different categories as part of that. The reimbursement challenge is very real, and it's convoluted and it's changing. CMS, Medicare and Medicaid, as they've seen a lot more of these underperforming devices and technologies at the market, the scrutiny is getting higher, and that involves everybody. So I think that's great because it leads to better technologies and proven technologies for patients, which is what should really work, which is where we should be. But data-driven decisions are going to be a much bigger part of things now, and data and cost, and that's even without even saying the general changes in technology, right? Wearables are a bigger thing. We have these a lot more than ever, combination drugs and devices. Um, but really, I think the biggest challenge is going to be data and the requirement for data, and how do you pay for that data? It's no longer going to be launching products and getting it after it's on the market. The onus is going to be up front. So developing better relationships with regulatory is part of it, and medical affairs. The great thing is medical affairs exist because of data, right? Collecting
I
data,
agree.
disseminating
I
data.
agree.
So it's a great place to be for medical affairs, but it's not as established as it is in pharma. So it's very, very important to come in with a good framework, to come in with a good plan, to operate in your company in the right way. But challenge creates opportunity. And I think when there's this data challenge and opportunity, medical affairs can be an enormous solution to that. So I think it's a good change. It's going to throw some people for a loop.
Fabulous answers, great insights, and in depth, comprehensive responses. Thank you, Greg, so much for being a part of the podcast and for enriching our viewers and audience with so much of information from the medtech space. And I'm very sure that our viewers and audience would really love to hear you whenever we, feature this episode.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me, Batati. That's great. And I know we've met through the Medical Affairs Professional Society. Like that's a great resource for MedTech too. We've been a small but growing team over the years, and I love to talk kind of med affairs, talk technology, riff on anything. If anybody wants, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not great about checking it. I'm not wonderful even at professional social media, but I promise eventually I'll get back to it, and just nice to meet people. So thank you for the opportunity and sharing some thoughts. And I appreciate it. It's been a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. And cannot wait to see what you will do in the next few years in the medtech space. We will be following you. And thank you for being our guest here in the
Thank
podcast.
you. I appreciate it.
For my viewers, I will say, as we have discussed today, it's very clear that the medical device industry really offers a lot of opportunities for the medical affairs professionals to push the boundaries for innovation and patient care. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. I hope today's discussion has sparked some new ideas and strategies for your own endeavor if you are part of the medical device industry. Until next time, stay curious and stay tuned to the upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening.